Auschwitz, winter 1942. The prisoners stand in formation, breath visible in the frozen air. Someone has escaped. The SS doesn't care who. They only care about the lesson. An officer walks the line. Slowly. His boots crunch on ice. Every man knows what's coming. One of them will die today. The officer stops. Points. You. The condemned man doesn't move. He can't. His wedding ring catches the pale morning light. Somewhere beyond these gates, a wife waits. Maybe children. He'll never see them again. But then another prisoner steps forward. Tall. Gaunt. His eyes burn with something the Nazis haven't crushed. He speaks in perfect German. I am a priest. Take me instead of this man. The guards stare. Prisoners don't volunteer for death. The officer studies him. You want to die in his place? Yes. Here's what most people don't know about the Holocaust. The Nazis didn't just build death camps. They built a system designed to destroy the human soul before destroying the body. They wanted to prove that under enough pressure, every man becomes selfish. Every man chooses himself. Archimandrite Grigol Peradze was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. 3 years earlier, Warsaw was a different world. The year was 1938, and the city's universities buzzed with intellectual life. In a modest office lined with ancient manuscripts, a Georgian Orthodox priest named Grigol Peradze bent over a Greek text, his pen moving across paper as he translated a 4th-century sermon. Grigol wasn't Polish. He was Georgian, born in the Caucasus Mountains, but Warsaw had become his home. At 38 years old, he was one of Europe's rising stars in Orthodox theology. He taught church history at the university, corresponded with scholars from Paris to Moscow, and could debate comfortably in 7 languages. Georgian flowed from his childhood. Polish and Russian came from his years in the East. German, Greek, and Latin were the languages of scholarship. French was for diplomatic correspondence. His students loved him. He had a gentle way of explaining complex theology, never making anyone feel stupid for asking questions. When a young seminarian struggled with Byzantine liturgical history, Grigol would stay late, patiently walking him through the material until it clicked. But Grigol was more than a professor. He was a priest, an archimandrite, which meant he'd taken monastic vows. He wore the long black robes of an Orthodox monk, let his beard grow according to tradition, and kept a prayer rope always in his pocket. His small Orthodox congregation saw him as their spiritual father. He baptized their children, heard their confessions, and buried their dead. He loved his life. The quiet of the library, the challenge of translating ancient texts, the satisfaction of helping students understand their heritage. On weekends, he would gather with other Georgian émigrés in Warsaw, sharing news from home and keeping their culture alive in exile. But in the summer of 1939, something changed. The news from Germany grew darker. Hitler's speeches became more aggressive. Colleagues began talking about leaving, about professorships in England or America. Some had already gone. Grigol watched them go without judgment. They had families to protect. But when his own bishop suggested he consider relocating to safety, Grigol hesitated. He looked at his congregation, mostly poor Polish Orthodox Christians who couldn't leave even if they wanted to. He thought of his Jewish colleagues at the university, already feeling the pressure of rising antisemitism. On the first day of September 1939, German bombers appeared over Warsaw. The invasion had begun, and Grigol Peradze faced the first great choice of his life. Before we continue with what happened next, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And if you believe stories like Grigol's deserve to be told, hit that like button. Most people have never heard of this Georgian monk who defied the Nazis. Your engagement helps these forgotten heroes get the recognition they deserve. Now, let's talk about the choice Grigol made when the bombs started falling. On September 1st, 1939, the first German bombs fell on Warsaw. The sound was unlike anything the city had heard before, a screaming descent followed by explosions that shook buildings to their foundations. Within hours, the streets filled with smoke and panic. Within days, the reality became clear. Poland was losing. The transformation happened with terrifying speed. The cosmopolitan capital that had hosted international conferences and championed religious tolerance became an occupied city within weeks. German soldiers marched through streets that still smelled of burning rubble. New rules appeared overnight. Jews were dismissed from their university positions. Foreign nationals received notices. Safe passage was being arranged for those not involved in the conflict. Grigol received his notice in late September. As a Georgian citizen, neither Polish nor at war with Germany, he could leave legally. His bishop visited him personally, urging him to go. Save yourself, Father. Save the manuscripts. Around him, colleagues were packing. Some headed for England. Others tried for America. The academic world was scattering like leaves before a storm. But Grigol couldn't stop thinking about his congregation. Poor Polish families who had nowhere to run. His Jewish colleagues, now wearing armbands and watching their world collapse. He remembered Christ's words about the Good Shepherd, how the hired hand runs when the wolf comes, but the true shepherd stays with the flock. On a crisp October morning, Grigol stood at his window and watched the last evacuation convoy roll out of Warsaw. He did not join it. Instead, he knelt before his icons and prayed for courage he wasn't sure he possessed. 3 weeks later, there was a knock at his door. A Jewish professor from the university stood there, pale with fear. Father Grigol, is it true? Are you helping people disappear? By 1940, the Nazi occupation had settled into brutal routine. Jews were herded into the ghetto behind brick walls and barbed wire. Intellectuals disappeared into Gestapo headquarters and never returned. Informants multiplied like rats, trading information for extra rations or simply survival. Warsaw had become a city of whispers and terror. Grigol discovered something unexpected. His clerical collar, the mark of his priesthood, had become a kind of armor. German soldiers were less likely to search a priest. His access to church properties gave him hiding places others lacked. His knowledge of church law and German bureaucracy became tools for a different kind of scholarship. He started small. A Jewish family sheltered in the church basement for 3 days before being moved to a safe house. Then came the forged documents. Grigol's steady hand, trained in copying ancient manuscripts, now produced baptismal certificates that transformed Jewish children into Christian orphans on paper. The documents looked authentic because Grigol understood how authenticity worked. Every stamp, every signature, every detail had to be perfect. His network grew carefully. A Polish countess named Helena offered her estate as a way station for those fleeing the city. A printer named Stanislaw created false identity papers in his shop's back room. A university janitor carried messages hidden in his cleaning cart. They all knew the stakes. Discovery meant torture and death, not just for themselves but for everyone they'd helped. Grigol became someone he barely recognized. The gentle professor who'd never lied now looked Gestapo officers in the eye and swore he knew nothing about missing Jews. The monk who devoted his life to truth now built elaborate fictions to save lives. His hands shook every time he forged a signature, but they never stopped moving. He whispered scripture to himself on sleepless nights. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? He'd found his answer. His soul depended on this work, not despite the lies, but because of what the lies protected. In late 1941, Stanislaw pulled him aside after delivering new documents. His voice was urgent and low. Father, they are watching you. Someone has talked. You need to be careful. Grigol nodded. But being careful meant stopping, and stopping meant death for those who depended on him. So he kept going. By early 1942, the walls were closing in. Grigol felt it in the way Gestapo cars lingered outside the church. In the sudden disappearance of Helena, the countess who'd sheltered dozens in her estate. In the forged baptismal certificate discovered during a random search that sent a family to their deaths. The net was tightening, thread by thread, and everyone in the resistance knew it. Warsaw had become a city of suspicion. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Friends betrayed friends. Not always from malice, sometimes from simple terror. The Gestapo had perfected the art of pressure. They would arrest a mother and tell her she could save her children by giving up one name. Just one name. What would you do? Grigol understood the moral mathematics of occupied Europe. Good people broke. Saints were rare. He knew he should stop. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at him to destroy his documents, disappear into the countryside, save himself while he still could. But 3 families were waiting for new papers. A Jewish child needed shelter before the next roundup. A resistance fighter required safe passage out of the city. How could he abandon them? How could he look at himself in the mirror if he did? The signs multiplied. Stanislaw, the printer, stopped answering messages. A Gestapo officer asked pointed questions about Orthodox church properties during a routine inspection. Someone was talking. Someone had given them enough to start connecting the pieces. On a February morning, cold and grey, the knock finally came. Not the frantic pounding of a desperate refugee, but the controlled, professional knock of men who already know they've won. Grigol opened the door to find 3 Gestapo officers standing there, their breath visible in the frozen air. "Father Grigol Peradze?" the lead officer asked, his German precise and polite. "Yes." "You are under arrest for aiding enemies of the Reich and engaging in subversive activities against German interests." The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sound like a door closing forever. Grigol glanced back at his apartment one last time. The books lining his walls, the icons he'd prayed before every morning, the desk where he'd forged so many documents. All of it became instantly distant, like looking at someone else's life. They walked him through Warsaw streets in broad daylight. A priest in handcuffs sent its own message to the city. The Gestapo wanted everyone to see what happened to those who resisted. The interrogation lasted 3 days. They wanted names, lists, details of his network. Grigol gave them nothing. He could endure physical pain, but he couldn't live with causing more deaths. So he stayed silent, and the silence cost him everything. In March 1942, they loaded him onto a cattle car with other political prisoners. The doors slammed shut, sealing them in darkness. As the train lurched forward, someone in the crowd whispered the question everyone was thinking. "Where are they taking us?" An old man's voice answered from the shadows. "Auschwitz." The journey to Auschwitz took 3 days, though time lost meaning in the darkness of the cattle car. Over 100 people packed into a space meant for 40. No food. No water. A single bucket in the corner for sanitation that overflowed within hours. The air grew thick with the smell of human waste and fear. Some prisoners died standing up, held upright by the crushing press of bodies around them. Grigol, who had spent his life in libraries and lecture halls, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the dying. The intellectual debates, the theological discussions, the careful translations of ancient texts, all of it belonged to a different universe. This was the real world, stripped of every civilized pretense. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, the light was blinding. Dogs barked. SS officers shouted commands. Prisoners stumbled onto a platform where men in striped uniforms moved like ghosts. An officer with a casual flick of his hand sorted the new arrivals. Left meant immediate death in the gas chambers, though the prisoners didn't know that yet. Right meant temporary survival through labor. Grigol went right. The dehumanization came in stages, each one designed to strip away another layer of identity. They took his clerical robes, the black garments that had marked him as a priest for 15 years. His head was shaved. He was forced to strip naked in front of strangers, processed through disinfection like livestock. A number was tattooed onto his arm, the ink burning as it marked him permanently. He had ceased to be Father Grigol Peradze, scholar and theologian. He was now a number in a system engineered to erase the soul before destroying the body. The first night in the barracks, Grigol lay on a wooden bunk and confronted the truth. Everything he'd believed about civilization, about human progress, about the triumph of reason over barbarism, all of it was a lie. Or rather, a thin curtain over an abyss that had always been there. The Nazis hadn't created evil. They'd simply organized it with German efficiency. A man near him began to weep quietly. Another prisoner, skeletal and hollow-eyed, muttered in Polish, "There is no God in this place. God is dead here." Grigol turned his head. His voice was hoarse but clear. "Especially here. God is especially here." The man stared at him like he was insane. Perhaps he was. But Grigol made a decision in that moment. If he was going to die in Auschwitz, and death seemed the only certainty, he would die as a priest, not as a number. His mission hadn't ended. It had simply moved to the darkest battlefield imaginable. Winter in Auschwitz was its own form of death. The cold cut through the thin striped uniforms like knives. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts hauling stones, digging ditches, building structures for their own imprisonment. The rations were calculated to keep a man alive just long enough to be useful. A piece of bread. Watery soup. Just enough calories to prevent immediate collapse, not enough to sustain life for long. Random executions punctuated the days. A guard would shoot a prisoner for moving too slowly, for looking wrong, for no reason at all. The smoke from the crematoriums rose constantly into the grey sky, a reminder that this place was designed for one purpose: the systematic destruction of human beings. Yet somehow, in this hell, Grigol Peradze continued to be a priest. It started small and secret. A whispered confession in the darkness of the barracks after roll call. A dying man asking for last rites, and Grigol murmuring the prayers from memory, his hand making the sign of the cross over a skeletal body. He had no holy oil, no sacred vestments, no proper altar. But he had the words, and in Auschwitz, words were everything. He saved scraps of bread from his own rations to offer communion. The bread represented Christ's body broken for the world. In this place where bodies were broken every day, the symbolism became almost unbearably real. Men would come to him in the night, whispering their sins, asking for absolution they weren't sure existed anymore. Grigol would listen and speak the ancient formulas of forgiveness. The SS punished religious practice viciously. They'd beaten a rabbi to death for trying to observe Sabbath. They'd hanged a Catholic priest for leading a secret prayer service. Grigol knew the risk every time he offered comfort, but he couldn't stop. To stop meant accepting the Nazi vision of humanity as mere flesh to be processed and destroyed. He met Piotr, a Polish resistance fighter wasting away from dysentery. The man was maybe 30 but looked 60, his body consuming itself from the inside. "Father, I killed Germans," Piotr whispered one night. "I killed them and I felt nothing. Am I damned?" Grigol held his hand. "You fought evil. That's not damnation. That's courage." There was Jacob, a Jewish convert to Christianity who wanted to pray the Lord's Prayer one more time before he died. Grigol prayed with him in the darkness, both of them knowing Jacob would be dead within days. He was. A young prisoner, barely 20, broke down one night. "My life meant nothing. I'll die here and no one will remember I existed." Grigol gripped his shoulder. "I will remember. God will remember. Your life matters because you lived it with dignity in a place designed to strip dignity away. That's everything." The paradox was cruel. Grigol was starving like everyone else. His body was failing. His strength was draining away day by day. Yet somehow, caring for others gave him reserves he didn't know he had. Perhaps purpose was its own form of sustenance. Perhaps the act of being a priest kept him human when everything around him was designed to reduce him to an animal. But there were nights when the doubts came. Lying on his wooden bunk, Grigol would stare at the darkness and wonder if he'd been wrong about everything. Should he have fled Warsaw when he had the chance? Was his God real, or was this camp the only truth that mattered? Was suffering meaningless after all? Then morning would come. He would rise with the others. And when someone approached him with desperate eyes and a whispered question about God, Grigol would answer. Not because he had all the answers, but because someone needed to believe that answers existed. A rumor began spreading through the camp. "There's a Georgian priest in Block 11. He hasn't given up. He still believes." In Auschwitz, where belief was the rarest commodity of all, that made Grigol Peradze dangerous to the Nazi vision and precious to those who still wanted to be human. The morning began like any other in Auschwitz. The brutal wake-up call before dawn. The stale bread and bitter coffee substitute that passed for breakfast. The slow shuffle toward the work details as guards shouted and dogs barked. Just another day of surviving. Then the whistles blew. Not the usual whistles signaling work assignments, but the sharp, urgent blasts that meant something had gone wrong. The guards were agitated, moving with purpose instead of bored cruelty. Within minutes, the entire block was assembled in the frozen yard for an unscheduled roll call. The prisoners stood in their striped uniforms, breath visible in the winter air, and waited. Everyone knew what unscheduled roll calls meant. Someone had escaped. Or something had been stolen. Or the SS simply needed to remind the prisoners of their complete powerlessness. The reason didn't matter. The lesson was always the same. An SS officer strode to the front of the formation. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of face that would have looked ordinary in any German town. But here, in this place, he held the power of life and death, and he knew it. "A theft has been discovered," he announced in clipped German. His voice carried across the silent yard. "Someone in this block has stolen food from the camp stores. This is sabotage. This is theft of Reich property." No one moved. The prisoners had learned that even breathing too loudly could draw attention. The officer continued. "Until the guilty party confesses, one man will be executed as an example. Let this remind you all of the price of disobedience." The collective punishment. The Nazi logic of terror in its purest form. Punish the many for the actions of one. Ensure that everyone is complicit in survival. Destroy any possibility of solidarity by making each man grateful it wasn't him chosen to die. The officer began walking slowly down the line of prisoners. He was in no hurry. He savored the power, the way every man tensed as he approached, the visible relief when he passed by. This was the selection process, arbitrary and absolute. Sometimes the guards chose the weakest, those who could no longer work. Sometimes they chose randomly, pointing at every 10th man. Sometimes they simply picked whoever annoyed them. Today, the officer stopped in the middle of the second row. He stood there for a long moment, studying the man in front of him. The prisoner was middle-aged, perhaps 40, though Auschwitz aged people so quickly it was hard to tell. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but he wasn't broken yet. Something in his posture suggested he still remembered being human. The officer pointed. "You." The word hung in the frozen air like a death sentence, which is exactly what it was. The condemned man didn't react with surprise. His face showed only resignation, as if he'd known this moment would come eventually. Everyone in Auschwitz knew their number would be called someday. Today was simply his day. Around him, the other prisoners had their own reactions. Some looked away quickly, unable to meet the condemned man's eyes, relieved beyond measure that the finger had pointed elsewhere. Some felt the crushing weight of survivors' guilt, knowing their continued life came at the cost of another's death. Most were simply too exhausted, too beaten down by the daily horror, to feel anything at all. But Grigol was watching. He stood 3 rows back, his gaunt frame barely visible among the other prisoners, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at the condemned man and saw something that made his heart clench. On the man's left hand, somehow missed during the initial confiscation, was a wedding ring. A simple band of metal that represented everything this place was designed to destroy. A wedding ring meant a wife. Maybe children. A family somewhere beyond these gates who still hoped, who still waited, who still believed their husband and father might somehow survive and come home. Grigol was a celibate monk. He had no wife waiting. No children who needed their father. He had chosen a life of solitary devotion to God. This man had chosen differently, and that choice meant someone in the outside world would be destroyed by his death. The SS officer stepped back, satisfied with his selection. "Step forward." The condemned man took a breath, preparing to move toward his execution. Around him, hundreds of prisoners stood frozen, each one silently thanking whatever God they still believed in that they'd been spared one more day. The moment of choice was here. The condemned man took a breath, preparing to step forward into death. His legs tensed. His shoulders dropped in final resignation. This was the moment. But before he could move, another voice cut through the frozen air. "Halt!" Every head turned. A tall prisoner was stepping out of the formation 3 rows back. He moved with deliberate slowness, his gaunt frame somehow carrying dignity even in the striped uniform. The guards tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. Prisoners did not break formation. Prisoners did not speak without permission. Grigol Peradze addressed the SS officer directly in fluent German. "I am a priest. Take me instead of this man." Silence crashed over the yard. Even the guards seemed momentarily frozen by the sheer impossibility of what they'd just witnessed. Prisoners did not volunteer for death. The entire system of Auschwitz was built on the assumption that survival instinct would override everything else. Yet here stood a man offering to die in place of a stranger. The SS officer studied Grigol with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. His eyes narrowed, searching for the trick, the angle, the hidden motive. Why would anyone do this? Was it an escape attempt disguised as martyrdom? Some elaborate plan? Or was this prisoner simply insane, his mind broken by the camp? "You want to die in his place?" the officer asked, his voice cold with suspicion. "Yes," Grigol replied. His voice was steady, clear, without hesitation. Inside, Grigol felt a strange peace settling over him. This was the culmination of everything he'd believed, everything he'd taught in Warsaw's lecture halls and preached from the pulpit. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. But this man wasn't even his friend. He was a complete stranger. That made it purer somehow. This wasn't about personal loyalty or emotional attachment. This was about the simple belief that one human life had infinite worth. The officer shrugged, as if the whole situation bored him now. "As you wish." Guards moved forward and pulled Grigol from the formation. The condemned man, suddenly reprieved, collapsed to his knees. Whether from relief or horror at what he'd just witnessed, no one could tell. His hands covered his face, and his shoulders shook. Grigol walked calmly to the execution point. He made the sign of the cross slowly, his hand moving from forehead to chest, shoulder to shoulder. His lips moved in a prayer whispered in Georgian, the language of his childhood and his homeland. He looked up at the sky, grey and smoke-filled, and perhaps in that moment he saw beyond the smoke. Perhaps he thought of his library in Warsaw, the ancient manuscripts he'd loved, the students he'd taught. Perhaps he remembered the faces he'd saved and grieved for those he couldn't. Or perhaps he simply prayed for the man whose life he'd just purchased with his own. The execution was swift. A single gunshot that echoed across the yard and faded into silence. The prisoners were dismissed back to their barracks. They walked in complete silence, each man alone with thoughts too large and terrible to speak. But something had shifted. In Auschwitz, the place designed to prove that humans were nothing more than animals fighting for survival, one man had proven the opposite. Even here, in hell itself, choice still existed. And Grigol Peradze had made his. The man whose life Grigol saved survived Auschwitz. Historical records don't preserve his name, but the tradition holds that he walked out of those gates when Soviet forces liberated the camp on January 27, 1945. He carried with him the weight and gift of another man's sacrifice, a burden and a blessing he would bear for the rest of his days. He returned to his family, if they had survived the war. He lived a life that was not supposed to be his. Every breath he took was borrowed from a Georgian monk who believed one human life was worth dying for. And if he had children, and those children had children, then entire family trees exist today because of a choice made on a frozen morning in 1942. This is the arithmetic of mercy. One life given, countless lives created. After the war, survivors came forward with testimonies about Grigol Peradze. They spoke of his underground network in Warsaw that had saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of Jews and resistance fighters. They testified about the priest in Auschwitz who continued his ministry in secret, who heard confessions in the darkness and offered hope to men who had every reason to believe hope was dead. On December 6, 1995, the Georgian Orthodox Church canonized Grigol Peradze as a saint and martyr. His feast day is celebrated every year, and his story is taught to new generations as proof that faith is not passive belief but active love, even unto death. Here's what matters. Grigol Peradze was not a superhero. He was a scholar who loved old books and quiet contemplation. He was terrified when the Gestapo knocked on his door. He suffered in Auschwitz like everyone else, starving and exhausted and broken by the daily horror. But when the moment came, he made a choice that most of us will never have to make, and he made it without hesitation. Somewhere in the world today, a descendant of that nameless man is living their life. Going to work. Raising children. Laughing with friends. Completely unaware that their very existence is a testament to a Georgian monk's final act of love. That is the legacy. That is the living gospel written not in words but in bloodlines that stretch into infinity. The story of Grigol Peradze teaches us something crucial about the nature of resistance during the Holocaust. While we often focus on armed resistance or dramatic escapes, the most common form of resistance was exactly what Grigol practiced: small acts of human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Every forged document, Every hidden family, every whispered prayer in the darkness was an act of defiance against the Nazi vision of humanity. The Holocaust didn't happen because of a few evil men. It happened because millions of ordinary people chose silence, chose compliance, chose to look away. Grigol Peradze chose differently. Not once, but every single day from 1939 until his death in 1942. His story matters today because the choice between silence and action still exists. The machinery of hatred still grinds in different forms across our world. And we still get to decide every day whether we'll be the ones who look away or the ones who step forward. If you were moved by this story, hit that like button and share it. Stories like Grigol's are seldom told, buried in footnotes of history books or preserved only in the memories of communities far from the mainstream. Your engagement helps push these forgotten heroes back into the light where they belong. Because the world needs to know that even in humanity's darkest hour, there were people who chose love over fear, sacrifice over survival, and human dignity over everything else. That's the story of Archimandrite Grigol Peradze, the Georgian monk who chose death so other prisoners could live.